Vancouver. Vancouver. This is it. Those were the last words anyone heard from David Johnston. 30 years old. A Ushku's volcanologist crouched at an observation post called Coldwater 2, about 6 miles north of a mountain that was seconds from erasing him. It was 8:32 in the morning. May 18th, 1980. He had a radio in his hand and a view of Mount St. Helens most scientists would have killed for. And in the space of a single breath, the north face of that mountain slid off in the largest landslide in recorded history, and a sideways blast of superheated rock and gas came screaming across the ridge at hundreds of miles an hour. Johnston never had time to run. His body was never found. 57 people died that morning. Loggers, photographers, campers who thought they were parked at a safe distance. The blast flattened around 230 square miles of old-growth forest. Trees snapped like matchsticks, stripped bare, laid down in neat rows all pointing away from the crater, like the ground itself had been combed. Within about 15 minutes, ash was punching up to 80,000 feet. That's roughly 15 miles straight up. Before lunch, the sky over eastern Washington went black at noon. Streetlights flickered on. The birds went quiet. Ash fell like gray snow across 11 states, drifted north into Canada, and within a couple of weeks, a thin veil of it had wrapped the entire planet. That's the mountain we're talking about. Mount St. Helens, officially, America's deadliest volcano. And here's the part that should raise the hair on the back of your neck. It's stirring again. Not erupting. Not yet. Nobody's telling you to pack a bag. The alert level sits at green. But underneath that quiet, snow-covered cone in Skamania County, something's been moving, and scientists have a very specific word for it. Recharge. In 2024, the seismometers threaded across the Pacific Northwest started catching them, small earthquakes. Deep down, several hundred of them clustered beneath the volcano. Not shallow tremors near the surface. Deep ones. The kind read as fresh magma pushing up from below, filling the plumbing at a depth of roughly 2.5 to 6 miles beneath the peak. Magma recharge. The mountain is refueling. So here's the first question I want you to hold on to, because it hangs over everything that comes next. If America's deadliest volcano has quietly started loading its chamber again, the same mountain that killed a man who saw it coming and still couldn't outrun it, how much warning would the rest of us actually get? Sit with that one, because the honest answer is uncomfortable, and I'll come back to it. Now here's the second thing. This is where it stops being one mountain and becomes a pattern. St. Helens isn't stirring alone. Run your finger down the spine of the Cascades, and you're tracing a line of loaded guns. In 2018, the Ushkas finished a massive national threat assessment, 161 volcanoes ranked. Published as Scientific Investigations Report 2018 to 5140. 18 of them earned the label Very High Threat. And the top 3 most dangerous volcanoes in the entire United States? Number 1 is Kilauea in Hawaii. Number 2, Mount St. Helens. And number 3, sitting there in Pierce County, Washington, 14,411 feet tall, wrapped in glaciers. Close enough to Seattle and Tacoma that on a clear day it fills the horizon like a second sun is Mount Rainier. 3 of the 4 deadliest volcanic threats in the country. 2 of them within a couple hours' drive of each other, both in Washington, both quietly monitored, both capable of things that make the 1980 blast look almost polite. And then there's the giant nobody can stop naming. Yellowstone, you've heard the word supervolcano. You've seen the documentaries, the countdown clock music, the maps of the whole country buried in ash. In July of 2024, exactly the kind of event that keeps that fear alive, a hydrothermal explosion tore through Biscuit Basin at a spot called Black Diamond Pool and blew a boardwalk to pieces right in front of terrified tourists. No eruption, no magma, just superheated water flashing to steam and detonating the ground. And it hit with essentially zero warning. So now you've got 4 systems. Mount St. Helens, refueling in 2024. Mount Rainier, ranked the 3rd most dangerous volcano in America. St. Helens with fresh magma in its veins. And Yellowstone, the sleeping continent-scale monster that just reminded everyone it can still throw a punch. 4 systems stirring, in parallel, right now. Which brings me to the question that gives this whole thing its shape, the one in the title. If, when, one of these goes, which places go first? Which towns, which valleys, which stretches of Washington and Wyoming and Idaho and Montana are the ones that don't get to wait and see? Because the answer isn't what the clickbait promises. No state is going to vanish in the Hollywood sense. There's no crack in the earth swallowing Seattle whole. But there are real places, real towns with real names, real schools that run evacuation drills, real neighborhoods built on top of the buried evidence of the last catastrophe, sitting directly in the path of what these mountains do when they wake. And here's the terrifying part. The danger isn't the same for any two of them. Helens kills with blast and ash. Rainier kills a completely different way, and it doesn't even need to erupt to do it. Yellowstone threatens a scale that's almost impossible to picture. Different mountains, different deaths, different maps. David Johnston knew, in his final seconds, exactly what was coming for him. He'd studied it. He'd argued to keep people back. He understood the mechanism better than almost anyone alive that morning, and it still took him in less time than it takes to say his last words twice. That's the gap I want you to feel. The distance between knowing and surviving. Because right now, beneath 4 different mountains, the instruments are ticking, the numbers are climbing, and the people paid to watch are watching very, very closely. So let's start with what's actually happening under Mount St. Helens right now, because that 2024 swarm is the loose thread. Pull it, and the whole picture unravels. Start counting the tremors, and the number that comes back isn't comforting. Through the first months of 2024, seismometers buried around Mount St. Helens picked up a run of small earthquakes deep beneath the crater floor. Not the sharp, shallow cracking you get when a lava dome shoves upward. These were deeper, quieter, the kind of signal that makes a seismologist put down their coffee and lean toward the screen. The Pacific Northwest Seismic Network logged them. The USCs read them. And the word they landed on is the one word nobody wants stuck to a volcano that already killed 57 people. Recharge. Recharge means magma. It means molten rock, pushing up from below, forcing its way into the plumbing of the mountain at a depth of roughly 2.5 to 6 miles, 4 to 10 kilometers down. Not erupting, not even close, yet but refilling. Reloading, the system that emptied itself in a single catastrophic morning back in 1980 is quietly topping off its tank again. And it's doing it in the geological equivalent of a whisper. Now I've got to be honest with you here, because the internet loves to inflate this. You'll see numbers thrown around, hundreds of quakes, dozens per week, precise counts that sound authoritative. The truth is more measured. The 2024 swarm was real. It was widely reported. Several hundred small, deep earthquakes over those months, exactly the pattern you'd expect from magma nudging its way up. That part is solid. The hyper-specific weekly tallies you'll find on some sites, treat those with suspicion. It doesn't matter whether it was 38 quakes one week or 30. What matters is the direction. The mountain is filling, not emptying. And this is the payoff to that thread I asked you to hold on to. When the instruments beneath St. Helens started ticking faster, they weren't announcing an eruption. They were announcing a process, a slow, deliberate, entirely natural process that's played out under this exact volcano for tens of thousands of years. And that ended once on May 18th, 1980, at 8:32 in the morning, with a lateral blast that flattened 230 square miles of forest and threw an ash column to 80,000 feet in about 15 minutes. 15 minutes. Sit with that. Ash to 15 miles up in the time it takes to microwave leftovers. So does the 2024 recharge mean St. Helens is about to blow again? No, and anyone selling you that certainty is selling you fear. Magma recharge is common. Swarms are common. Most of them lead nowhere for years, decades, even centuries. The volcano can breathe like this for a very long time without ever taking that fatal exhale. But, and this is the piece that keeps the people at the Cascades Volcano Observatory paying attention, St. Helens is the historically deadliest volcano in the United States, and it's the one showing the clearest signs of refilling. That's exactly the kind of alignment that gets written up in weekly reports. As recently as mid-July 2026, updates out of the observatory noted small earthquakes continuing at St. Helens, alert level held at normal, green, business as usual. Green doesn't mean nothing's happening. Green means what's happening is expected. Those are two very different sentences. Here's the twist though. If you're ranking American volcanoes by which one could kill the most people, St. Helens isn't even at the top of the list. In 2018, a team of USCA's scientists, led by geologist John Ewart, published something called the National Volcanic Threat Assessment, a formal ranking of 161 volcanoes across the country. Of those, 18 got flagged as very high threat, and when they crunched the numbers, the top 3 weren't some mystery cave in Alaska or a remote peak nobody's heard of. Number 1 was Klauia in Hawaii. Number 2, Mount St. Helens, and number 3, the one I actually lose sleep over, Mount Rainier. Why Rainier? Ewart's own framing is worth quoting because it cuts through the noise. He said the ranking is not a list of which volcano will erupt next. Instead, it is a way to help focus attention and resources where they can be most effective. Read that again. It's not a prediction of eruption, it's a map of consequences. And the way the USGS builds that map is by multiplying 2 things, hazard and exposure. How dangerous is the volcano, and how many people are standing in the way. Rainier is the perfect, terrible marriage of both. It sits at 14,411 feet, wrapped in more glacial ice than any other peak in the lower 48. And it sits within sight of Seattle and Tacoma, with millions of people living in the valleys that drain off its flanks. High hazard. Enormous exposure. That's why a volcano that hasn't had a major eruption in centuries ranks above the one that just started refilling. But it's not the eruption that terrifies the scientists. It's the mud. Here's the part almost nobody outside geology understands. Rainier doesn't need to erupt to become a catastrophe. Deep inside the mountain, acidic hot water has been chemically rotting the rock for thousands of years, turning solid stone into weak, waterlogged clay. Geologists have a grim nickname for it, the soggy cracker. All that ice on top, all that rotten rock underneath. If a big enough chunk of the flank simply lets go, no eruption required. It turns into a fast-moving river of mud, boulders, and shattered ice called a lahar. And lahars don't stay on the mountain. They pour into the valleys. The Puyallup, the Nisqually, the Carbon, the White River, every one of them carved a path off Rainier and straight into the Puget Sound lowland. Follow those valleys downhill, and you hit the names on the hazard maps. Orting, Sumner, Puyallup, Auburn, Buckley, real towns, real schools, real people asleep in beds tonight. Orting is the one that haunts me. It sits about 120 feet above the valley floor, directly in the primary lahar path, and the kids there don't do fire drills the way you did. They do lahar drills. They practice running uphill, away from the river. Because everyone in that town knows that if the mountain lets go, the warning window is measured in minutes, not hours. Children in Washington state rehearse outrunning a wall of mud. That's not a movie. That's a Tuesday. We know this because it's already happened. Around 5,600 years ago, a massive collapse off Rainier sent the Osceola mudflow roaring down the mountain. It traveled roughly 75 miles, 120 kilometers, all the way into the Puget Sound lowland, carrying an estimated volume of rock and debris large enough to reshape the landscape. And here's the detail that should stop you cold. Parts of the Kent Valley and the Commencement Bay area around Tacoma, places where people live and work and park their cars right now, sit directly on top of those old Osceola deposits. The ground under those neighborhoods is the mud from the last time Rainier let go. So when we ask which places disappear first, this is where the answer starts to sharpen. It's not abstract. It's not a whole state swallowed in one blow. It's specific valleys, specific towns, following specific rivers off a specific mountain, a geography written into the land by the last disaster and waiting to be traced again by the next one. And the cruelest part of the Rainier scenario is the timing. The 2024 St. Helens recharge gave scientists weeks of warning signals. A Rainier flank collapse might give almost none. which raises the obvious, uncomfortable question: is the mountain showing any signs at all right now? Because in the summer of 2025, something happened beneath Rainier that made the seismologists sit up. And it was the largest of its kind ever recorded, early July 2025. The seismometers ringing Mount Rainier lit up all at once, a cluster of small quakes, reportedly more of them than any swarm ever logged beneath that mountain. Hundreds of tiny tremors, most too faint to feel, stacking up hour after hour. And here's the part that calms people down the moment they actually understand it. A swarm like that is not a countdown. Swarms happen. Water moves through hot rock. Old faults shift. Magma nudges upward, then stops cold. The authors of the 2018 assessment were blunt about this exact mix-up, and it's worth saying out loud because it drives half the panic online. Earthquake swarms don't mean an eruption is coming next Tuesday. They mean something underground is restless. That's all. Until it isn't. That one distinction is why Yellowstone needs a hard reset in your head right now. Because if you've ever typed anything about American volcanoes into a search bar, the algorithm's been feeding you the wrong nightmare for years. Yellowstone is not the country's most dangerous volcano. In that 2018 USGS threat assessment, the one that ranked 161 volcanoes and flagged 18 as very high threat, Yellowstone lands in the high threat tier, below Claudia, below St. Helens, below Rainier. Sit with that for a second. The place everyone pictures as the continent-ending monster isn't even in the top group of what scientists actually lose sleep over. Yes, the caldera is real. Yes, it's produced 3 enormous eruptions: Huckleberry Ridge around 2.1 million years ago, Mesa Falls around 3 million, and the Lava Creek event roughly 631,000 years back. And yes, if the biggest of those repeated, the ash would bury parts of Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho under crushing depths, with a lighter dusting drifting across much of the continental U.S. That's the picture the clickbait sells you: whole states erased under gray. But Dr. Michael Poland, who runs the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory, has spent years shoving back on that fantasy. He points out that the magma chamber under the park is mostly solid rock, not some sloshing pool ready to blow. The real near-term danger at Yellowstone isn't a super eruption at all. It's smaller, faster, and it already happened, right in front of tourists. July 23, 2024, Biscuit Basin, just off the Firehole River near the Upper Geyser Basin. Black Diamond Pool detonated in a hydrothermal explosion, superheated water flashing to steam, hurling rock and boiling debris, tearing apart the boardwalk where people had been standing minutes earlier. No magma, no eruption, just the plumbing of the park venting its fury with zero warning. That's the Yellowstone hazard that's real on a human timescale, not the state-swallowing ash myth. A geyser basin that can turn lethal in a heartbeat. So put it all together, and the title's promise finally resolves into something honest. Which states vanish first? Not the way the phrase makes it sound. There's no single button, no one blast that swallows Washington or Wyoming whole. The truth is stranger, and a lot more specific than that. The places that go first are the valleys. Orting, sitting about 120 feet above the valley floor, drilling its schoolchildren to run for high ground. Sumner, Puyallup, Auburn, Buckley, towns platted straight onto the floodplains of the Puyallup, Nisqually, Carbon, and White Rivers. Parts of Kent and Tacoma's Commencement Bay area, built, unknowingly, right on top of the Osceola mudflow. That 5,600-year-old wall of debris that traveled roughly 75 miles off Rainier and settled into the ground people now call home. Those are the first to disappear if the mountain lets go. And it could let go without a single drop of new lava, just from its own hydrothermally rotted, clay-weakened interior giving way. Next to feel it, the forests and the downwind states. In 1980, St. Helens flattened around 230 square miles of timber, drove an ash column to roughly 80,000 feet in about 15 minutes, and dropped measurable ash across 11 states, with more drifting into Canada. And recharged beneath that same mountain in 2024, magma creeping up from 2.5 to 6 miles down, is the clearest sign any of these systems has given that the machinery is loading again. Yellowstone's ash geography, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho at the center, is the outermost ring of the answer, the one that would take the longest to arrive, the least likely to come in our lifetimes. That's the reveal. The states don't vanish in one apocalyptic frame. They vanish in a sequence dictated by geography, river valleys first, ash zones second, and the mythical supereruption dead last, if ever. The danger was never one mountain. It was the specific path water and rock will take off each waking system, drawn into the land by the last catastrophe, waiting to be traced again. Which brings it back to a ridge 6 miles north of Mount St. Helens, where a young USG's volcanologist stood at an observation post called Coldwater 2 on a spring morning in 1980. David Johnston believed the mountain was dangerous when almost no one else did. He got one sentence out before the lateral blast reached him. Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it. His body was never found. He was 30 years old, and he'd been right about everything except how little time there would be. Everything we know now, the threat rankings, the lahar maps, the seismic nets strung across Rainier and St. Helens and the Cascades, exists partly because of what happened to him and to the 56 others who died that morning. The monitoring he fought for is automatic now, patient, indifferent to whether anyone's watching. Right now, tonight, deep under all that snow and clay and rock, the instruments are still ticking. Reading